The morning the locks were changed on 14 Carver Street, I was standing in the lobby with a rolling suitcase and a cardboard box when the young man from the property management company arrived. He had a toolbox and a work order and the particular efficiency of someone doing a job that required him not to think too much about what it meant. He changed the lock on the front door without speaking to me. I watched him work. Then I picked up the suitcase and the box and walked out. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I was 70 years old that October. I had lived in that building for 22 years, on the third floor in an apartment that faced south and got good winter light, which I had always considered its best feature. Bernard had died in the apartment 5 years earlier, in the spring, in the bedroom that faced the courtyard, and I had stayed because leaving felt wrong, and because the rent was manageable on Social Security and the small pension from his business. The building had sold in August to a company in New Jersey. The letters that arrived on cream paper were polite and specific. Existing leases would not be renewed. Mine had expired in September. I had spent October looking for somewhere to go. Bernard had been a watchmaker. He ran a small repair shop on Main Street in Garfield for 35 years, and for the last 20 of those years I had worked the counter. We had no apprentice, no employee, no one trained in the particular careful work he did. When he died, I had closed the shop within a month. I had not known how to carry it without him inside it. The landlord on that building had wanted someone else too, and the space had been a dry cleaner's by Christmas. What I had kept was his loupe. A 10-power watchmaker's loupe, brass barrel with a hinged protective sleeve, the metal worn smooth from the way he had pressed it to his eye for 3 decades. I wrapped it in flannel and put it in my coat pocket before I packed anything else. It seemed like the right order. My son Gary called 4 times during those 6 weeks. He had researched a retirement community in Binghamton and described it in one text message as quite nice with activities. He did not offer the deposit on a new apartment. He did not offer his spare room. He offered Binghamton, which he had not visited, on the basis of a website. My daughter Patricia offered her spare room with a list of practical considerations, and among them was something about contributing to household expenses that she left in an undefined amount. Her husband Thomas had a way of standing in doorways and exhaling that I had experienced once over a holiday weekend and had no interest in living alongside permanently. I spent 2 nights at the Garfield Public Library. It opened at 8:30 and closed at 7, and the librarians in the periodical section left me alone, which was the most anyone had offered me all week. On the second morning, I was sitting at a table, not reading anything in particular, when the Holt County Gazette from 3 days prior caught my eye. It was folded back to the classified section. A box notice near the bottom, set in slightly larger type than the surrounding listings, read, "Auction." The county was selling properties with unpaid taxes. The auction was the following afternoon in the county administration building on Church Street. Minimum opening bid for any property was $1. Buyers assumed all liabilities. Cash or certified check only. I read the property list twice. Most were vacant parcels or former commercial lots I had no way of evaluating. Near the bottom of the list was one that read differently. A residential and light industrial structure on Millrace Road, listed as a grist mill of historical designation, approximately 2,400 square feet of ground floor space, built circa 1889, with 1 acre of creekfront property included in the parcel. The structure was condemned per the county building assessment dated June of that year. I had $412 in my checking account. My next deposit was 8 days away. I had $5 in cash. I sat with the notice for a long time. Not because I was deciding. I had already decided, in the way you decide things that do not feel like decisions. I sat with it because I wanted to understand what I was doing clearly before I did it. I was going to bid on a condemned stone mill with $5 because it was the only thing in the county I could afford, and having something that was mine, even something broken, was different from having nothing at all. The auction was held in a ground floor conference room. About 30 people sat in folding chairs facing a low podium. Most were men in work boots and field coats with clipboards on their knees. They spoke in the shorthand of people who had done this before, and they carried the collective ease of people who would be driving home tonight to a house that had not changed while they were away. I found a chair near the center and sat with my hands in my lap. The county clerk ran through the rules at the speed of someone who has read them aloud many times. All sales final. All properties as is. Payment within 30 minutes of closing bid. The first 9 properties moved quickly. Vacant lots went for a few $100s. A former dairy barn with structural problems went for $9,000. I watched the pattern of how the room moved and learned the rhythm of it. When the clerk reached the mill, 2 men in the front row conferred briefly over a shared clipboard. One raised his hand for an opening bid at $250. Another countered at $300. A brief exchange, and then the second man looked at his notes and did not raise his hand again. $300, going once, the clerk said. I raised my hand. She looked at me over her reading glasses. $305 from the woman in the center. The man who had last bid turned fully around in his chair. He looked at my rolling suitcase, which I had kept beside me because there was nowhere else to leave it. He looked at my coat. He turned back and set his clipboard on the empty chair beside him. Going twice. Nobody moved. Sold. Millrace Road to the woman in the center. Please come forward to sign. I paid the $5. The clerk explained afterward, in an aside that was neither unkind nor particularly warm, that since no other bidder had countered after my raise, the sale was valid at the $5 cash payment. I had not known this when I raised my hand. I had raised it with $5 because it was what I had. She handed me a photocopied survey sheet and the deed documents. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone about to say something they feel obligated to say. The structure is condemned, she said. You cannot legally occupy it in its current condition. I understand, I said. No utilities to the site since 2019. The road floods in spring. No water service. I understand, I said. She stamped the deed. I tucked the documents inside my coat beside Bernard's loupe and thanked her. I called Gary from the parking lot. I told him I had purchased property at a county tax auction and would be in touch once I was settled. He said, in the tone of someone who has come to expect unreasonable things, "Mother, what have you done?" I told him I would call when I had power to the phone and disconnected before the next sentence arrived. The woman behind me at the administration building was driving toward Mill Creek Road to visit her sister and offered me a ride as far as the county route turnoff. Her name was Faye, and she was an assessor's clerk who did not ask many questions, which I was grateful for. She let me out at the turnoff with directions that included a road sign hanging at an angle. I walked the remaining 3 miles on a road that went from paved to packed gravel to 2-tire tracks through dead November grass. The cold came off the fields in flat, steady currents. The sky was the white gray of a day that has no opinion about itself. I heard the mill before I saw it. The creek came through the sound of the trees first, water moving over a stone bed, continuous and unhurried, present underneath everything else. Then the tree line opened, and the building was there. The lower level was fieldstone, gray and settled, the kind of stonework that does not announce itself, but simply continues. The upper level had been wood frame construction, and a section on the east side had given way at some point, taking part of the roof down with it. The remaining upper portion leaned toward the intact side the way something leans that is still standing but not pretending otherwise. Along the north face, the millrace ran close to the building's foundation, still carrying water, though the wheel was mostly absent. The iron axle housing remained, wrapped in decades of vine growth, and a few spoke remnants hung from it. But what had been the wheel was mostly the shape of where the wheel had been. The main door, set into the stone face at ground level, was planked timber banded with iron straps, gray and checked with age, but present. I stood at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at it for a while. I did not think it was beautiful. I thought it was old, which is not the same thing. I thought it had been here for 130 years and was still standing, which is a different kind of qualification. A man came around the north corner of the building. He was in his mid-70s, lean, carrying a walking stick, wearing a canvas coat and work boots with the easy, unhurried gait of someone who knows this stretch of road well. He stopped when he saw me and did not appear startled. "August Reinhardt," he said. "Gus, I live a quarter-mile south. Walk past here most evenings." "Eleanor Voss," I said. "I own the mill as of this afternoon." He looked at the building. He looked at me. He appeared to accept this without requiring additional context. "That door's swollen in its frame," he said. "You'll need a pry bar." He was back in 20 minutes in a pickup truck of indeterminate age and careful maintenance. With a pry bar and a flashlight and a thermos of coffee he set on the hood without comment. We worked the pry bar into the lower hinge gap together, and the door gave after several minutes. The air that came out was stone and creak damp and something else underneath, the particular dry stillness of a space that has been closed for a long time. The mill floor was a single large room, the millstone housing at its center, a raised stone structure with the upper stone still in place, layered in dust but intact. The floor was wide-board wood under debris, fallen plaster, leaves carried in through the broken window openings, the collapsed remains of old shelving along the east wall. A fireplace occupied the south wall, stone-built, the chimney intact where the wall met the upper structure. Gus moved through it with the unsentimental eye of someone who has worked on old buildings and knows what matters. He tested the floor in 3 places with his boot heel. He checked the chimney with a burning piece of newspaper from his coat pocket, watching where the smoke went. When it drew cleanly, he built a fire with dry timber he brought in from a fallen log near the creek that he had judged sound enough. He left me the lantern from his truck cab, the folded wool blanket in its plastic sleeve, and the thermos with coffee still in it. Before he left, he stood in the doorway for a moment. "I'll stop in the morning," he said. "If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." The fire was real and the lantern was steady and the deed was in my coat pocket with Bernard's loupe, and those were the facts of my life at that moment, which I held in order and did not add to. Outside, the creek ran its course over the stone bed the way it had run the night before I arrived and would run the night after I was gone. A sound that belonged to no one and therefore belonged to everyone. I found it easier to sleep to than I had expected. I slept on the blanket near the fire with my coat over my shoulders and slept without dreaming, which is what I usually hoped for. Gus came at 8 the next morning with a thermos of coffee and a canvas bag that held a battery lantern with fresh cells, a folding camp stove, 2 tins of soup, and a hand broom with a worn but functional head. He said he had these things sitting around. I accepted them in the spirit offered, which was practical and required no acknowledgement beyond use. He walked the ground floor with me in the daylight and identified what needed attention in order. The east section of the upper level was the primary concern. It had to be brought down in a controlled way before it came down on its own. The stone walls were sound. The chimney had good draw. The floor, once cleared, was workable. He asked about my situation, practically, in terms of money and getting around. I told him, Social Security in 7 days, no car, no one local, just over $400 until then. He was quiet for a moment. "Greta Hines runs a supply shop on the county route, for miles back," he said. "Lost her counter help last month. She might take you on mornings. I drive past twice a week. There's a man named Dell who drives the route the other mornings for his hardware operation." Greta Hines was 64, direct-spoken, running a small operation that sold livestock feed, hardware, and specialty seed stock to the farms along the county route. She looked at me with the frank assessment of someone who has made enough hiring decisions to have stopped padding them. 6:30 to noon, she said. "Receiving, stocking, and register. For mornings a week. $12 an hour, and I'll put you on books. You have transport?" "Arranged," I said, which was close enough to true. She wrote my name in a ledger book kept beside the register, and that was the whole of the negotiation. I began the following Monday. For mornings a week, I was up before 5 and on the road by 5:30, walking the county route in the dark with the lantern until Gus or Dell came past in the other direction. I worked until noon and walked back and spent the remaining daylight hours in the mill. The cold was significant for the first 2 weeks, and then my body adjusted to it in the way that bodies adjust to things they have no choice about. I cleared the main floor room by room. I worked with the hand broom and my gloved hands and the borrowed wheelbarrow Gus brought over on the 3rd day, hauling debris out through the main door and piling it at the edge of the cleared ground. My hands blistered and then stopped blistering. My back ached for 10 days and then stopped. What I uncovered as I worked held the evidence of the building's working life. Along the east wall, the remnants of the old grain bins. There would gone to powder in places, but the iron hardware intact, the hinges and latches still serviceable. On the south wall beside the millstone housing, someone had scratched a column of measurements in pencil and later in something harder, a narrow stylus perhaps, the markings running down 3 feet of stone. Weights, tallies, the commercial record of some long finished season. I left them on the wall. They seemed to belong there. In the debris near the window opening, I found 2 intact ceramic crocks and a hand-forged iron hook of the kind used for hanging tools. I kept the hook. It went above the fireplace, and I hung the lantern from it each evening, and the light it gave the room was better than the floor position I had been using. Behind the millstone housing, a doorway opened to a secondary room, lower-ceilinged, narrower, darker. Off that room, a plank door led to a stair going down to the cellar. I cleared the main floor first, working in what felt like the right order. What is most present before what is most hidden? The secondary room took 3 days. The debris was thicker there, partly water damage from a crack in the upper wall that Gus later mortared closed from the outside. I worked inward from the doorway, clearing in sections. The floorboards were in worse condition than the main room, but were structurally present. As the room emerged from its debris, I could see it had been a finished space. Plaster on the walls, a window opening on the east side now empty of its frame, a wooden shelf bracket still attached to the south wall. Against the north wall, pushed into the corner where the stone foundation met the wood frame partition wall, there was a cabinet. At first I had taken it for part of the collapsed shelving. When I cleared the debris from around it fully, I stopped working and looked at it properly. It was a freestanding cabinet, 4 feet wide and roughly 6 feet tall, built from a wood I did not immediately identify in the lantern light. The joinery at the corners was close-fitted, the kind of work done by someone who learned the craft as a trade and not a weekend interest. The door faces had raised panels with a carved border running the width of the top rail, a pattern of interlocking gear shapes, small and precise, the kind of decorative motif chosen by someone who worked with gears as a matter of daily life. The iron hardware had been made for the piece. The hinges were hand-forged. The latch was a type Bernard had shown me once in an old catalog, a German lever mechanism, the kind used by cabinet makers in the Rhineland through the early 20th century. I opened the latch. The doors swung with the resistance of wood expanded by years of temperature change, but they swung. Inside, on 3 shelves, objects were arranged under a canvas cloth that had stiffened with age. I lifted the corner of the canvas on the top shelf and drew it back. Tools. A fitted wooden tray holding the instruments of a clockmaker's trade. A set of turns, the brass still bright beneath the tarnish. A staking set in its original fitted case. A mainspring winder. A selection of pinion files in a leather roll. A micrometer with a maker's mark on the thimble that I recognized from one of Bernard's trade catalogs. A Swiss instrument manufacturer that had operated from 1882 until some point in the mid-20th century and whose tools Bernard had described as the standard by which other tools were judged. I stood with the lantern raised and did not move for a long time. I knew all of it. I had spent 35 years in a shop where these instruments lived. I had cleaned tools like these in the Saturday routine Bernard kept. Each piece in its place, the leather roll folded and tied with the particular half-hitch he used, the tray returned to the left side of the bench. Not the same tools, not the same hands, but the same knowledge, the same craft, the same care that turns a workbench into something more than a surface. Someone had worked here. Someone had done Bernard's work in this stone room, before the mill closed, before the wheel went silent, before the vines grew over the iron housing and the windows went dark. On the second shelf, a wooden case of the same careful joinery as the cabinet itself. A brass latch and a sunken pull. I opened it. Inside, in what had been green baize and was now a faded gray-brown, lay the movement of a mantel clock. The plates were brass, tarnished to deep amber. The train wheels showed through the frame, clean and precisely cut, free of any debris. The escapement pallet rested at a position that told me what I needed to know. This clock had been stopped deliberately by a hand that understood the mechanism well enough to know where to leave it. I closed the case. I set it back on the shelf. I stood in the doorway of the secondary room with the lantern and turned toward the north foundation wall. I had noticed it on the second day of clearing. A section of plaster on the north wall, roughly 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, its surface slightly smoother than the surrounding stone face, its color marginally lighter. Applied after the original construction, at some point when the building was still in use. A repair, I had thought. A patch over some damage in the stone. I crossed the secondary room now and pressed my palm flat against that section. Under my hand, through the plaster, I felt the edge of something. Not stone. Metal. A linear cold, the unmistakable temperature of iron set into the wall and covered over. And at the corners of the section, just at the limit of what my fingers could detect, the slight depression of a frame. The draft I had noticed on the coldest mornings, seeping through the north wall, came through that section specifically. I had attributed it to gaps in the old mortar. It was not gaps in the mortar. I took my hand off the wall. I stood in the secondary room with the lantern in one hand and looked at the plaster and the cabinet and the tools and the clock movement, and I understood, in the way that understanding comes when you have enough pieces and can no longer pretend you don't, that what I was looking at had been arranged. Not left by accident. Arranged, with the intention that the arrangement would survive and that someone would eventually come and recognize what they were looking at. I was that someone. I had spent 35 years in a watch repair shop married to a man who had talked about old movements the way other men talk about things they love, and I had learned the language without intending to. And now I was standing in a stone room where that language was the only one that mattered. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow I would look for the key. I spent 2 days looking for the key. Not frantically. I am not a person who searches frantically. I went through the secondary room in sections, starting at the doorway and working inward, pressing my hands along the floor joints and the wall where it met the stone foundation, checking the underside of the shelf bracket still attached to the south wall, clearing the debris that remained in the northwest corner behind the cabinet. I went through the main floor with the same method. I checked behind the millstone housing, under the window sills, along the top of the fireplace lintel. I went down the stair to the cellar and moved through it with the lantern, which was a room of bare stone and old flood sediment along the south wall, containing nothing except the base of the chimney and 2 iron wall brackets for torches or lanterns. No key. On the morning of the second day, I sat on the workbench stool I had brought in from Greta's discard pile and drank my coffee and looked at the cabinet. The cabinet held tools and a clock movement and 2 more cases I had not yet opened on the third shelf. It also held, I was now certain, more information than I had read out of it yet. A clockmaker who built a puzzle into the room itself, who plastered an iron door and covered it under an ordinary plaster finish and trusted that the right person would eventually come, would not have left the key to that door somewhere ordinary. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I went back to the cabinet and opened both doors and stood before it with the lantern at the correct height to see without casting shadow. I opened the 2 remaining cases on the third shelf. The first held another movement, smaller than the mantel clock movement on the second shelf, the kind used in a bracket clock or a shelf piece. The second held a set of hand files in a leather case stitched with a name in thread, W. Hartmann. The name of the maker, sewn into his own tool case, as if he had anticipated that the case might someday belong to someone who did not know whose hands had held it. I set the file case aside and looked at the cabinet interior again. The shelves were fitted pieces, not floating boards. The back panel was tongue-and-groove wood, close-joint. I ran my fingers along the back panel in sections. At the center of the back panel, level with the second shelf, I felt something my eyes had missed, a slight regularity in the surface. Not a flaw in the wood. A series of small ridges arranged in a circular pattern, beneath a thin coat of the same finish as the rest of the panel. I held the lantern close. The gear pattern border carved along the top rail of the cabinet, the decorative motif I had noticed when I first uncovered the piece, ran its interlocking pattern across the width of the doors. I had understood it as ornamental. Looking at it now, I could see that one of the gear shapes in the border, centered above the latch point, sat slightly proud of the surrounding carving. Not by much, barely the depth of a coin, but the surface there was smoother, worn by handling in a way the surrounding wood was not. I pressed it with my thumb. It moved. Not far, not freely, but it rotated, a fraction of a turn at a time, with small detents I could feel through the pad of my thumb. A clockmaker's trick, a rotary mechanism built into a decorative element, functioning as a combination lock. I had seen Bernard repair a box like this once, brought in by an estate, a German piece from the previous century. He had spent a morning on it and explained the mechanism to me while he worked, the way he explained things, quietly, in the order the parts required. I did not know the correct number of positions. I turned the hidden dial 1 click at a time, pressing the main latch between each position. On the 7th click the latch gave The back panel of the cabinet swung forward on a hidden hinge at its left edge, revealing a shallow compartment behind it, perhaps 3 inches deep, built into the thickness of the back panel and the frame of the cabinet itself. Inside the compartment, a key and a letter folded twice. The key was iron, heavy for its size, with a bow in the old European style, a flat oval loop at one end, the shank long and straight, the bit cut with 3 teeth. It was not rusted. Someone had oiled it before sealing the panel, and the oil had preserved the metal through 80 years. The letter was written on paper that had stayed dry and supple in the sealed compartment. 2 pages, both sides of a single folded sheet. The handwriting was clear and careful, the English of someone who had learned the language young and written it all his life. September 12, 1943. My name is Wilhelm Hartmann. My father was also Wilhelm Hartmann. He came from Baden-Württemberg in Germany in 1888 and built a flour mill on Millrace Creek in Holt County. He was a miller by trade, but a clockmaker by training. In the region where he was born, these 2 things were not unusual to find in the same man. A miller understood mechanical systems. A clockmaker built them. My father did both for the 30 years he operated this mill, and when the milling was done for the day, he went into the room behind the north wall of the secondary storage room, and he made clocks. I am writing this on September 12th. I ship out on September 22nd. I have no wife and no children. My father died in 1919 and my mother the year after. The mill has been closed since 1938 because the county built the new grain elevator on Route 9 and there was no longer enough business to justify the operation. I have been living in the house on the adjacent lot and running the property as best I could, and I am not certain I will come back from where I am going, and I am not certain the property will be cared for properly if I do not. My father's workshop is behind the north wall of the secondary storage room. The door is iron, set into the stone foundation, and I have plastered over the frame on both sides to keep the moisture out and to keep anyone from opening it carelessly. The key to the door is the one you found in this compartment, which means you understood the cabinet well enough to find the panel, which means you are someone who knows this kind of work, at least somewhat. I am asking you to be careful with what is in that room. My father made 17 clock movements over the 30 years he worked in that shop. 9 of them have finished cases. He carved the cases himself in the tradition he was trained in Germany, but he made them here, in this county, and so they show things from here. The creek, the mill wheel, the birds he watched from the workshop window. There is no other work like it that I know of. I have read enough about American clockmaking to know that what my father made is not ordinary. The movements alone would be considered significant. The cases with the movements inside them are something else again. He also made 1 tall case clock, a grandfather clock as they call it here, which stands against the east wall of the workshop and is complete in every part. He finished it 2 months before he died. I have kept it wound until recently. I stopped winding it when I knew I was leaving because it seemed wrong to let it run down while I was gone. If it is wound again, it will run. His notebooks are in the oak cabinet on the north wall. They are in German, but the drawings are clear enough in any language. I do not know who you are. I hope you are someone the room found for a reason. Wilhelm Hartmann Jr. I read the letter twice, standing in the secondary room with the lantern in my hand. Then I sat down on the floor, which was not something I had planned to do, and read it a 3rd time with my knees drawn up and the letter held flat on them. 17 clock movements. 9 finished cases, hand-carved. 1 complete grandfather clock. The notebooks of a craftsman who had spent 30 years building things in a room that no one had opened since September 1943. I thought about Bernard holding the loupe to his eye. I thought about the way his voice had changed when something old came in from an estate, a European piece with a movement he had not seen before. I thought about the Saturday routine, the tools returned to their places, the leather roll tied with the half-hitch, the bench wiped clean at the end of the work. I did not know who you are. I hope you are someone the room found for a reason. I had spent 35 years married to a watchmaker. I had learned to recognize the tools of the trade without having to think about it. I had found this cabinet in a condemned stone mill that no one else had bid on, and I had understood what I was looking at because I was the only person in my life who could have. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it against my coat. I went to find Gus. He was where he usually was on a Thursday afternoon, in the woodlet a quarter mile south, splitting kindling for the week. I told him what I had found. He set down the maul and listened with the focused attention he gave to structural problems. All of his concentration, none of his expression. "Show me," he said. We went back to the mill together. I showed him the cabinet panel, the compartment, the letter. He read the letter standing, the way he read everything, and handed it back carefully. "You'll need a cold chisel for the plaster," he said. "I have one at the house." He looked at the wall section. The door itself might be difficult. 80 years in a stone wall. "The key was oiled," I said. He thought ahead. Gus looked at the cabinet and back at the wall with the expression he used when he was revising his assessment of something. "He did," he said. "He went to get the chisel." We worked the plaster off the sealed section of the north wall over the course of an afternoon, Gus using the cold chisel with the careful strikes of someone who has worked on stone buildings long enough to know the difference between controlled removal and damage. The plaster came away in sections, revealing the iron door frame beneath it, set flush into the stone courses, its edges fitted tight. The door itself was bored and batten iron, roughly 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, with a single keyhole in a hand-forged plate on the right side. I fit the key into the lock. It turned. Not easily, not in a single motion, but it turned. The mechanism was stiff from 80 years of cold and stillness, but the oiling Wilhelm Jr. had done in 1943 had preserved enough of the function that the tumblers moved when I applied steady pressure. Gus stood back. I put both hands on the key and turned it fully until the catch released. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The door had been sealed at its edges with the same plaster Gus had chipped away from the frame. The plaster had long since dried and contracted slightly, and the door, when I pulled, came free of the seal with a sound like something being separated that had grown together over time. The air that came through from the other side was different from the mill's air. Older, drier. The particular stillness of a sealed space that has not exchanged itself with the outside world in 8 decades. Cold, but a different cold than the stone rooms above, more settled, more absolute. I pushed the door fully open. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I moved. The room was roughly 20 feet by 12, cut entirely from the stone foundation of the mill, with a low ceiling of fitted stone and a floor of wide flagstone that had been leveled with care. A single aperture high in the north wall, no larger than a dinner plate and fitted with a piece of thick glass now clouded with age, had been the only source of natural light. It was sealed from the outside with a wooden shutter Gus later identified from the exterior when he walked the north face of the mill. Along the east wall stood the workbench. It was a solid piece of work, built from oak, 8 feet long, its surface clear except for what had been left there deliberately on the day the room was sealed. A cloth spread under the tools arranged in the order of a man who had put them down expecting to pick them up again, but understood he might not. A magnifying lens on an articulated arm. A watchmaker's depthing tool. A wheel-cutting engine of the kind used to fabricate escape wheels to precise specifications. The kind of tool that was never purchased in a hardware store and was always made or commissioned by the man who needed it. Against the south wall, 9 clock cases stood in a row, each one separated from the next by a strip of felt cloth that had kept them from touching through 80 winters. They were of varying heights, the smallest a shelf piece roughly 14 inches tall, the largest a bracket clock nearly 2 feet, and each one was hand-carved from a single piece of wood. The wood I later learned was American black walnut, sourced from this county, which Hartmann had chosen for its stability and its grain. The carving on each case was different. One showed the mill wheel in low relief, the paddles worn by centuries of water, circling in perpetual motion across the front panel. One showed a great blue heron in the moment before it struck, its neck curved and its eye precise. One showed the Millrace Creek as seen from above, its curves moving across the case from bottom to top, with a fish visible in the carved water and a pair of kingfishers at the top rail. I went from case to case with the lantern raised, not touching, just looking. Against the north wall, an oak cabinet stood closed. On the south side of the cabinet, pinned to the stone with an iron tack, was a sheet of paper I could not read in the lantern light. I crossed the room and held the lantern close. German, written in the same deliberate hand as the letter. A title at the top that I could not translate, but recognized as a table of contents for what was in the notebooks inside. In the center of the room, against the east wall, to the right of the workbench, the tall case clock. It was 6 feet and 4 inches tall, which I measured later. The case was walnut, like the others, carved with a full scene on the front panel. The mill itself, as it had looked when it was working, the wheel turning, water moving in carved rivulets down the base of the case. The building's stone courses rendered in fine detail from the foundation to the roofline. The hood of the clock was carved in the German tradition, columns flanking the dial with acanthus capitals, the frieze above carved with gear motifs that echoed the pattern on the cabinet in the secondary room above. The dial was painted tin, white ground with black Roman numerals, with a moon phase complication in the arch above the chapter ring, showing a hand-painted moon traveling across a field of stars. The hand stood at 3:10. The clock had stopped at 3:10 on some September afternoon in 1943, when Wilhelm Hartmann Jr. had let it run down and sealed the door and walked away from his father's work for what turned out to be the last time. I stood in front of it for a long time. I had the loupe in my coat pocket. I took it out and held it to my eye and looked at the dial up close, at the painted numerals and the moon disk and the fine brushwork of the stars. Bernard had held this to his eye 10,000 times. He had looked through it at the tiny world of a movement, at the tooth geometry of a wheel or the banking angle of a pallet, and he had seen something ordinary people could not see without it. I was looking at a clock dial, but the lens through his hand and mine felt, in that moment, like a continuation of something. I went to find Gus, who was waiting in the secondary room. He came to the doorway and looked. He did not go in. He stood in the doorframe and swept his eyes across the workbench and the cases and the tall case clock and the closed cabinet on the north wall, and his face held the expression of a man who has seen good craftsmanship his whole life and knows when he is in the presence of something beyond his own experience of it. "How old?" he said. "The collection goes from about 1889 to 1919. 30 years of work." He was quiet for a moment. "What's it worth?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I know who to ask." I had no telephone signal at the mill. I never did, in that first winter, unless I stood in the cleared ground on the east side of the building and held my phone above my head, which worked intermittently. For a call that mattered, I drove to Greta's shop and used the landline in the back room. Gus drove me the following morning. I had written down the name I needed from a directory Greta kept at the shop. Dr. Peter Van, professor of horological history, Holt County Regional University, whose name I had found in the footnotes of an article about American clockmaking that Gus had pulled from the library in town. I called the university switchboard. I was transferred to the history department. The department assistant told me Dr. Van was in a seminar and would return the call. I left the shop number, Greta's landline, and a brief message that I had found a sealed workshop containing the complete output of a 19th century clockmaker, including 17 movements, 9 carved cases, a tall case clock, and 30 years of technical notebooks, and that I believed the collection to be significant. He called back in 40 minutes. His voice was careful, the careful voice of a man who has learned to regulate his excitement when he hears something that could be either a genuine discovery or a misunderstanding from someone without the relevant knowledge. "When you say the carved cases," he said, "can you describe the carving for me?" I described the mill wheel case, the heron case, the creek case with the fish in the water and the kingfishers at the top rail. There was a pause. "Regional scenes," he said. "Original scenes, carved into the case itself, not applied ornament." "Yes," I said. "The carving is integral to the wood." Another pause, longer. "And the movements are still in the cases?" "Some of them. Others are on the workbench. There are also movements in wooden cases in the outer room that appear to be presentation pieces. And the tall case clock is complete and was wound until 1943, according to the letter." "There's a letter from the clockmaker's son," I said, "dated September 1943. It describes the contents of the room and the history of the maker." The pause this time lasted long enough that I thought the line had dropped. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I'd like to come and see this." "When?" I said. "What are you doing Saturday?" That was 3 days away. I told him Saturday was fine and gave him directions from the county route. The call from Gary came the next morning when I was at Greta's shop. She handed me the receiver with a look that said she had told him I was available. He had heard about the mill through Patricia, who had heard it from me when I had called her the previous week with the number at Greta's shop. Patricia had apparently told Gary, and Gary had apparently looked up the property. There's a company that's been inquiring about Millrace Road parcels, he said. His voice had the careful tone he used when he was coming at something sideways. Commercial development. I spoke to a representative. They'd make a reasonable offer on the property. It's not for sale, I said. Mother, you're living in a condemned building in November. You don't have heat. You don't have running water. I have a wood stove and a creek, I said. I've managed. This is not a reasonable way to live. I'm aware of your assessment, I said. The offer they described would be enough to put you somewhere decent. Somewhere with actual utilities. I looked through Greta's backroom window at the county route running past the shop. A truck went by pulling a flatbed with a piece of farm equipment on it, something large and rust-colored under a tarp. The kind of thing that looks like nothing from the road. Gary, I said, I want you to understand something. The property is not for sale and will not be for sale. If someone from a development company contacts you again, you can tell them the owner has declined. A silence. You don't know what you have out there, he said. No, I said, but I'm about to find out. I handed the receiver back to Greta and thanked her for the use of the phone. She looked at me with the frank expression she used when something struck her as notable. Who's coming Saturday? She said. She had heard me on the earlier call. A historian, I said. From the university. She nodded, the nod of someone who is connecting pieces she has been watching accumulate for some time. Does he know what he's coming to see? He knows enough, I said. The rest he'll see when he gets there. I went back to the mill that afternoon and spent the remaining daylight hours in the workshop. I did not touch anything. I walked through the room with the lantern, looking at what was there in the order it had been arranged, and I thought about Wilhelm Hartmann Jr., who had come from Baden-Württemberg in 1888 with a craft and a plan, who had built a mill on a creek in Holt County and worked it for 30 years, and who had also, every evening after the milling was done, come down into this stone room and made something beautiful. He had not been known for it. The letter said nothing about recognition, nothing about exhibitions or sales or correspondence with museums. It described a man working in the evenings after the workday, building things for the reason that he knew how to build them and could not stop. The notebooks were his record, and the workshop was his world, and 30 years of it stood against the south wall in 9 walnut cases, each one different, each one showing something he had seen from the workshop's one small window. Before I left that evening, I stopped in front of the tall case clock. I had the key that wound it. Wilhelm Jr. had included a winding key on a hook beside the clock's trunk door, labeled in his handwriting on a small paper tag. I had not touched it. I looked at the dial. The hands at 3:10. The moon disk showing a painted crescent in a field of hand-painted stars. I left it there. It had waited 80 years. It could wait 3 more days. Saturday, I told myself. The historian would come. We would look at the collection together. And then I would have numbers instead of estimates, words instead of impressions, and I would know precisely what I was standing in. I walked up the stair from the workshop, through the secondary room, into the main mill floor, and out through the heavy, iron-banded door into the November dark. The creek ran its line beside the building. The stars were clear over the tree line, the kind of cold, clear November night that has no charity in it, but gives you the sky unfiltered in exchange. I stood outside for a moment, and then I went in and built up the fire. Dr. Peter Van arrived on Saturday at 9 in the morning in a blue sedan that needed new wiper blades, which I noticed because it had rained overnight, and the smear pattern on the windshield was the kind you learn to recognize as a problem deferred. He was 62, slight, wearing a canvas field coat over a button-down shirt, and he carried a camera bag over one shoulder and a leather document case under his arm. He shook my hand at the main door and looked at the building the way people look at things they have been thinking about on the drive over. I showed him the main floor first, then the secondary room and the cabinet. He spent 10 minutes with the cabinet, photographing the joinery and the carved gear border and the concealed panel before I demonstrated the mechanism. When the panel opened and he saw the empty compartment, he photographed that too. He asked the dimensions of the compartment and wrote them in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. I handed him Wilhelm Jr.'s letter. He read it at the doorway of the secondary room, standing very still, and then read it again. When he finished the second reading, he looked at the letter for another moment without reading. The way you look at something when you are understanding it rather than processing it. Baden-Württemberg, he said quietly. Black Forest training. That's the Freiburg tradition. There are perhaps 8 known clockmakers from that tradition who immigrated to the United States before 1900. None of them are documented to have maintained a complete workshop output. Until now, I said. He looked at me. Until now, he agreed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. We went down to the workshop. I led him through the iron door and stood back while he moved through the room. He was methodical. He began at the workbench, photographing the tool arrangement without disturbing it, writing notations in his small book. He identified the wheel-cutting engine by manufacturer and estimated its date. He examined the depthing tool, the turns, the file collection in the leather roll, and he photographed each item separately and in sequence, his movements careful, his expression concentrated. He stood in front of the 9 cases along the south wall for a long time. He looked at the mill wheel case first, and then the heron case, and then the creek case with the kingfishers at the top rail. He did not touch them. He crouched to see the base of the tallest case, and then stood and looked at the carving at eye level, and then stepped back to see the whole piece at distance. Regional scenes, he said. Hand-carved, integral to the case structure, not applied ornament. American subjects rendered in a European formal tradition. He looked along the row. Each one is different. Yes, I said. He didn't repeat himself. No. He photographed each case from 4 angles. He looked through the glass panels on the cases that had them, reading the dial styles and the hand profiles. After the cases, he went to the oak cabinet on the north wall and opened it. Inside, in leather-bound volumes standing in a row, the notebooks. 30 years of documentation in German, each volume dated on the spine in the same careful hand. He lifted the first volume, which covered 1889 to 1893, and opened it to the middle. He looked at the page for a long moment. The drawings are to scale, he said. He drew the movements to scale with the actual components. This is not a sketchbook. This is a technical record. Can you read the German? Enough to confirm what I'm seeing. He turned a page. He's documenting his temperature compensation method. This is a technique that professional horologists argued about in correspondence for decades. He worked it out here, in this room, and wrote it down. He set the volume back with the care of someone returning something that belongs in a museum. He turned around and faced the tall case clock. He stood before it without speaking for long enough that Gus, who had come to the workshop doorway to listen, shifted his weight on the flagstone. It's complete, Dr. Vance said. Movement, case, moon phase complication, original hands. He looked at the stopped hands. 3:10. He stopped it before he sealed the room. I said. The letter says he kept it wound until then. It will run, he said. Not a question. The letter says so. He turned to face me. Mrs. Voss, what I'm looking at is a complete primary source collection. The movements, the cases, the tools, the notebooks, the provenance letter. Wilhelm Hartmann is not in the horological record at all. He is entirely unknown. This workshop is the entirety of the documentation of his life's work, and it is the most complete single craftsman collection I have encountered in 23 years of working in this field. He paused. You need a specialist appraiser. I can recommend someone. His name is James Kavanaugh. He's based in Philadelphia, and he is the person I would trust to put numbers to this. What kind of numbers? I said. He looked along the row of cases. I don't want to speculate without a proper appraisal, he said. But I want you to understand that a single piece from a documented craftsman of this period and tradition would be significant. 9 cases, the complete movements, the tools, the documentation, the grandfather clock. He stopped. I don't want to speculate. But, I said. He met my eyes. But you should not sell anything until James Kavanaugh has been here and you have a proper legal framework in place. He stayed for 4 hours. He photographed the entire workshop and the secondary room and the cabinet and the letter, and he took measurements I did not understand the purpose of but assumed mattered to someone. Before he left, he stood at the door of the mill and looked back at the building the way he had looked at it when he arrived, except that now the look had different information in it. I'll call Kavanaugh tomorrow, he said. He'll want to come as soon as possible. Tell him not to rush on my account, I said. The room has waited 80 years. He smiled, the brief, real smile of someone who is not accustomed to smiling at work and means it when he does. It has, he said, but I'm afraid I might rush on mine. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. James Kavanaugh arrived 8 days later in a car more expensive than Dr. Van's, and with an equipment case that told me he had done this before and understood what came in and out of the field. He was 55, compact, with a watchmaker's habit of looking at things closely before deciding what they were, which I recognized because I had lived with that habit for 35 years. He spent 2 full days in the workshop. He was the first person I allowed to handle the pieces. He wore cotton gloves and worked with the focused patience of someone to whom precision is not a discipline, but a reflex. He examined each movement in the case clocks with a loupe, his own, and he spent 3 hours alone with the tall case clock, the trunk door open. The movement examined component by component. He read enough German to work through the relevant sections of the notebooks with a dictionary he carried in his bag. He asked me 12 questions across the 2 days, each one specific, each one requiring only a short answer. On the evening of the second day, he sat at the rough table I had set up near the workshop door and opened his notebook and went through his figures in the order he had assembled them. The 9 case clocks, movements, and cases together range from $8,000 for the smallest shelf pieces to $14,000 for the pieces with the most complex movements and the most detailed carving. The mill wheel case and the heron case were at the upper end of that range. The total for the 9, at conservative estimates, was $94,000. The 8 additional movements without cases ranged from $3,000 to $5,500 each. Total, $28,000 at the low end. The tall case clock he appraised separately. He said he had seen 4 tall case clocks from the Freiburg-trained immigrant tradition in his career, all of them in museums. None of them with regional American carving on the case. None of them with a documented provenance and complete workshop context. The moon phase complication was original and functioning. The carved mill scene on the case was, in his professional opinion, the finest single piece of horological woodwork he had encountered in private holdings. His range for the tall case clock was $52,000 to $78,000, with the upper end dependent on the right buyer. He looked at the total figure he had written at the bottom of the page. Conservative combined appraisal, $174,000. With the upper estimates on the significant pieces, the collection could reasonably be presented at $220,000. He closed his notebook. The notebooks and correspondence add to the historical significance but are difficult to assign a direct monetary value to, he said. What they do is make the collection whole. A buyer who understands what they're looking at will pay for the wholeness of it. The kind of collector who acquires a piece like this grandfather clock wants to know the man who made it as well as they can. He looked at the clock. The notebooks let them know him. I thought about Wilhelm Hartmann Jr. working in this room in the evenings after the mill went quiet. 30 years of evenings. A candle on the bench, the stone walls around him, the creek moving outside through the seasons. No audience. No market. Just the work. I thought about Bernard at his bench on a Saturday in the watch repair shop with the door locked and the closed sign in the window, working on something that interested him, not something that had been brought in. Those were the hours he talked about most. What would you recommend? I asked Kavanaugh. He considered it. Sell selectively, he said. The collection is more significant whole than in pieces. But 4 of the case clocks, the simpler shelf pieces with the less complex movements, could be sold without diminishing the historical integrity of what remains. At conservative values, those 4 pieces would generate $35,000 to $42,000. That gives you working capital to restore and protect the remaining collection without having to liquidate anything that shouldn't be liquidated. And the grandfather clock, I said. Stays, he said, without hesitation. The grandfather clock is the anchor of the collection. Whoever holds it holds the argument for everything else. Gary called the following week. He had learned about Kavanaugh through Patricia, who had heard from me that a specialist appraiser had visited. His voice when he called had changed from the call before it. The careful tone was still there, but the confidence behind it had shifted. He knew something had happened that he had not accounted for. I'd like to understand the situation better, he said. Whatever's going on out there, I'm still your son. I should know. You know what I've told you, I said. The mill has a significant collection in it. I am handling the collection through proper channels with legal and expert guidance. The property is not for sale. What does significant mean in terms of value? I had spent some time deciding how to answer this question when it came, and it had come in the form I expected. It means I'm not going to need anyone's help, I said. And it means that the offer you called me about last month from the development company is declined and will remain declined. He was quiet. I was trying to help, he said. I know, I said. So was I, when you needed $14,000 in 2009. People try to help in the ways that are available to them. I did not say it harshly. I said it the way it was true, which was plainly. Patricia drove out the following Saturday without calling first. I heard the car on the track and came out to the cleared ground and watched her park and get out. She was dressed for the drive, not the destination, which was how she had always traveled, and she stood by the car and looked at the building with the expression of someone who had prepared several versions of this conversation and was not certain which one to begin. I walked her through the main floor and the secondary room and down to the workshop. She stood in the doorway of the sealed room and looked at the cases along the south wall and at the grandfather clock and did not say anything for a long time. He's been here the whole time, she said finally, and I understood she meant something beyond Hartmann's tools and cases. She meant the building itself. She meant that I had been here, and she had not come until now. Yes, I said. She looked at the heron case. The carved bird in its moment before the strike, neck curved, I precisely rendered. It's beautiful, she said. And she meant that simply, without strategy. It is, I agreed. We stood in the workshop for a while, and then I took her upstairs and made coffee on the camp stove, and we sat at the table near the fireplace and talked for an hour. Not about the collection or the money or what I had said to Gary. About other things, her marriage, which was more difficult than she admitted to people, and about our mother, who had been dead for 30 years and whom we both remembered differently, and about Bernard, whom Patricia had liked more than she ever said while he was alive. She told me she had been in the watch repair shop the week before he died, to pick up a bracelet clasp he had repaired for her, and that he had been in particularly good humor that day, and that she had meant to mention it to me afterward and had never gotten around to it. I had not known that. It was a small thing, and it was good to have it. We did not resolve anything. We were not in the business of resolution, not yet, maybe not for a long time. But we sat at the table in a mill I had bought for $5 in November and talked the way people talk when they have decided to stop performing their version of the situation. When she left, she stopped at the door. I should have offered you the room without conditions, she said. Yes, I said. I'm sorry. I know, I said. And then, come back in the spring. The creek is something to see when the water comes up. She nodded once and walked to her car and drove back down the track. I stood on the cleared ground and watched her go and felt the particular quality of something that has not been fixed but has been named, which is its own kind of progress. The creek moved beside the mill. A pair of crows crossed the field line at the south tree edge and disappeared. The ordinary world going on. The county designated the mill as a historical site in March of the following year. Dr. Van managed the documentation process with the State Historical Preservation Office, and the designation came through with a small annual maintenance stipend attached, the kind of stipend that is not large but is steady, and steady was what I needed. I sold 4 of the case clocks through Kavanaugh in the spring, the 2 smallest shelf pieces and 2 of the mid-range bracket clocks. A collector in Ohio bought 2. A horological museum in western Pennsylvania bought 1 for its permanent collection and sent a letter about it that I framed and put in the workshop beside the bench. The 4th went to a private buyer in Vermont who had been looking for a piece from the Freiburg immigrant tradition for 11 years. The total from the 4 sales was $38,000. With that money, I had the east section of the upper level properly demolished and reconstructed. A stone mason from the next county did the work, a man Gus knew, who understood old stone and did not try to make it look new. I installed a wood pellet heating system that kept the main floor and the workshop at a consistent temperature through the following winter. I had the workshop professionally cleaned and documented, the cases examined and stabilized, the notebooks photographed for the university archive. I kept working at Greta's shop 2 mornings a week because I liked the walk and I liked Greta, and because useful work is its own kind of reason. I had Bernard's loupe on the workbench in the workshop, on a small leather square I had cut from one of his old strops. It lived there. It was the right place for it. On a Tuesday in April, 5 months after I had turned the iron key in the lock, I went down to the workshop in the morning and wound the grandfather clock. I used the winding key Wilhelm Jr. had left on the hook beside the trunk door. The clicks of the ratchet were precise and even, the springs taking tension the way they had been built to take it. I wound both the time train and the strike train and the moon phase, which required a different motion, a hand turn of the moon disk until it aligned with the calendar date. I closed the trunk door and stepped back. The pendulum had been displaced during transport of the clock to a slightly different position after the spring cleaning, and I corrected it with a touch. It swung. The escapement engaged, the familiar double tick of a lever escapement, the clock's heartbeat beginning after 80 years of silence. I sat down on the stool I kept in the workshop and listened to it run. Wilhelm Hartmann Sr. had finished this clock in 1917, 2 years before he died. He had built everything. The movement, the case, the hand-painted dial with the moon and stars, the minute and hour hands shaped to a pattern I had found in one of the early notebook pages and recognized as a traditional Black Forest profile. He had done all of it in this stone room, in the evenings, by whatever light the room had. The clock kept near perfect time. Kavanaugh had told me it would. He had examined the temperature compensation system that Hartmann had developed and documented in the notebooks, and he had said that the design was, by his measurement, as accurate as movements being made professionally in Switzerland at the same period. A miller in Holt County, working in the evenings with tools he had brought from Germany, had solved a problem that occupied professional horologists for decades. Nobody had known. The notebooks sat in the oak cabinet, and the clock stood against the east wall, and the plaster covered the iron frame of the door, and the room waited, the way rooms wait, without impatience, without any awareness of time at all. I thought about Wilhelm Jr. sitting in this room in September 1943, winding the clock for the last time, and then letting it run down, writing his letter at the workbench by candlelight, oiling the key and putting it in the puzzle box, and setting the dial on the hidden mechanism. He had thought about the person who would come. He had tried to arrange things so that the person who came would be the right one. He had not come back to know whether it had worked. It had worked. Not because I was clever, and not because I was lucky, though luck was part of it. Because I had spent 35 years with a man who had taught me, without meaning to teach me anything, to recognize the language of careful work. Bernard had held his loupe to his eye and looked at the small mechanical world of a movement, and I had stood at the counter and listened to him explain what he saw. And I had learned enough of that language to walk into a condemned stone mill and understand what was in the room before I had even found the door. The clock ticked. The pendulum moved. The moon disk sat at its correct position in the arch above the chapter ring, a painted crescent in a field of painted stars. I looked at the cases along the south wall, the heron in its moment of stillness, the creak moving across the front panel from bottom to top, the mill wheel turning in carved perpetuity. I did not know what Wilhelm Hartmann Sr. had believed about what happened to things after the people who made them were gone. I only knew what the room held as evidence, that he had worked here for 30 years in the evenings after the milling was done, and that he had not worked for recognition or for sale, but because the work was what he knew how to do and he could not stop doing it well. And because of that, and because his son had oiled a key and built a mechanism into a cabinet and written a letter to an unnamed stranger, the work was still here. I had come in November with $5 and a rolling suitcase and a watchmaker's loupe in my coat pocket. I had not known what I was walking into. I had known only that it was mine, and that mine was a different thing from nothing. The door at the end of the hall had been sealed for 80 years. It was not sealed against me. It was sealed against everyone else who had come before me, everyone who would have come and not known what they were looking at. I knew. That was the whole of it. I knew because Bernard had spent 35 years teaching me without knowing he was teaching me anything, and because a mill in Holt County had waited for the person who spoke the right language, and because I had $5 and no other options, and the particular stubbornness that comes from having already lost most of the things you were afraid of losing. The clock ran. The pendulum moved in its measured arc. The spring held its tension and the train wheels turned and the escapement released its count, one beat at a time. In the stone room where a man from Baden-Württemberg had once worked in the evenings by candlelight and built something no one was supposed to forget. Someone remembered now. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.